Welcome, everybody. So just so that I don't have to adjust the camera and lose being able to see Steve's beautiful face, I'm going to do the introduction from over here so that I'm not speaking from beyond for the folks on Zoom. Hey, everybody. My name is Carol Allman-Morton. I'm the executive director here at OLLI Berkshire Community College. I'm delighted to welcome you this afternoon. I want to thank our OLLI at BCC sponsor, Berkshire Health Systems, berkshirehealthsystems.org, and our OLLI BCC Distinguished Speaker Series sponsor, Kimball Farms Life Care at kimballfarms.org. You can go to berkshireolli.org/events anytime to see our full calendar of programming. Just a few highlights of upcoming programs. Registration for our spring semester courses is open, and you can see that at berkshireolli.org/spring 2026. And then here in this room and also on Zoom on Thursday, we're presenting together with Berkshire County Historical Society, War in the Berkshires, Poverty and Public Relief before 1935 with Cynthia Farr Brown. And that's at 5:30 p.m. And that talk will examine being poor in the Berkshires from the mid-18th century when Europeans settled in the region until the depths of the Great Depression. And I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. But for the folks in the room, you don't have to remember a complicated thing, just berkshireolli.org/events. And then also coming up this month, we have Intersections of Faith, Feminism, and Activism, Progressive Islam and Social Justice with Ani Sonnenfeld. That's Monday, March 30th at 7 p.m. That will also be in person and live streamed in person at Zion Lutheran Church in Pittsfield and live streamed through YouTube, I think. But if you register, you'll get the link. And we have lots more stuff, but I'm going to not mention it now so that we can get to the top. If you're on Zoom, I encourage you to put questions in the chat and I'll read them out loud here in the room so that Steve can answer you when we get there. And I want to welcome Stephen Reed Nelson, the author of Fire in a Wire, Electricity Empowers Human Evolution Beyond Homo Sapiens. Steve is a graduate of Cornell University, a math major, and Harvard Law School. He first thought about the impact of electricity on humans when living without it while doing anthropology research in the Peruvian Andes. He's been an entrepreneur of cutting-edge electrical technologies, such as broadband internet, solar energy, rock concerts, computer software, and video production. And he lives here in Williamstown. Welcome, Steve. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Thanks to OLLI for giving me the opportunity. Thanks to you people who are here in person for joining us, and to all of you out there, presumably on Zoom, although I can't see you. So I'd just like to say, welcome humans. And what I mean by humans is the familiar species Homo sapiens. So I'd like everybody who is a Homo sapiens to raise their hand. Well, I guess that includes everybody, but not me. I'll explain. So conventional wisdom says that sapiens, after millions of years, is the sole surviving species of human. But I disagree. I'd say that a new species of human is emerging and living among us today. And I'm a member of that species. It may turn out that some of you are as well after you hear my talk today and explain how this new species is coming about. So now, speaking of sapiens, I assume some of you have read this book. I see some nods, okay, probably at home too. Very popular book. In fact, it's the biggest selling nonfiction book of the 21st century. So the author, Juval Noah Harari, talks about three major revolutions in the evolution of Homo sapiens: the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, and then the scientific revolution. But what does he have to say about electricity? Well, I looked at the index. I read the book, but that was what I read to prepare. I looked at the index, and it talks about nuclear power stations producing cheaper electricity. Well, that's not very interesting. And then he goes on to talk about the various kinds of inventions of electricity. We flick our fingers, print books, sew clothes, keep our vegetables fresh, etc. Electricity does all these things and more, but he doesn't really go on to explain what the implications of all this use of electricity are. And in my opinion, electricity is enabling humans to evolve beyond Homo sapiens. So because I'm challenging Harari and conventional wisdom, I'd like to introduce myself. You heard some of my background. I'm not an academic or a scientist, and you might say I'm an outsider. Just as the employee of the Swiss Patent Office in 1905, who came up with an outsider, who came up with the formula E equals mc squared, whom you know as Albert Einstein. Another outsider, an obscure monk in Czechoslovakia in the middle of the 19th century, discovered the laws of heredity, a man named Gregory Mendel, whose name you may not know. Now, I'm not saying that I'm an Einstein or Mendel, but I think I'm a pretty rigorous thinker. I was a math major in college. I went to Harvard Law School, and I did all these entrepreneurial activities involving cutting edge applications of electricity. But I also lived without electricity. As an undergraduate, I got a grant to live among the descendants of the Incas in Peru, in a community that was at 10,000 feet in the Andes and had no electricity. So the experiences of working with all these applications of electricity and living without it, I think kind of gives me a unique perspective. So my views on electricity and evolution are really based on experience, not formal academic training. So we talk about evolution, of course, you have to start with Charles Darwin. And he had no academic training in evolution either. Of course, at the time, there was no such discipline as evolution, so you couldn't very well major in it. But when he graduated from Oxford, he went on a trip around the world, which lasted almost 5 years, on a ship called the Beagle. Later wrote a book about it, and which he was a naturalist, and his job as a young man was to collect various specimens and to catalog them. And the thing that struck him was the incredible variations in all these species. So when he got home, he kept thinking about this, and it took him another 20 years or so, but he did figure out what we think of now as his theory of evolution. And he published it in a book called On the Origin of Species. And this was quite a sensation at the time, a bestseller. And I'd just like to read you some of what he said about evolution, if I can find it here. Okay, so, and this is me writing about Darwin. So Darwin observed that many more members of his species, quote, are born that can possibly survive. So there is a, quote, recurring struggle for existence. If through natural variance of beings should have a trait slightly more favorable for survival, then it will be, quote unquote, naturally selected. And that trait will be inherited by its progeny. So we have too many people, beings, creatures, critters struggling to survive. Some of them will do through natural variation, wind up with favorable traits, the tendency of those traits to be inherited and passed along. And if enough of them accumulate over time, they can amount to species evolving. So, but Darwin also said the following. There is a grandeur, speaking about his views on evolution, and this is at the very end of the book. There is a grandeur in this view of life. Endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And that word evolve was the last word in the book, and it's the first time you refer to evolution in the whole thing, even though he's writing all about it. And I just like to stress that word are being evolved, because when I say that humans are still evolving, that's consistent with what Darwin felt, that evolution was ongoing. So my point is that human evolution is not ending with Homo sapiens. We are still being evolved. So how did I come to write this book about human evolution? Well, one afternoon I was sitting in my house here in the Berkshires, looking out over the sun setting over the hills, and I was thinking about a project I had just been working on. It was called Wired West, and I was one of the leaders and founders. I guess you recognize it. And what we did was to build fiber optic networks and deliver high-speed internet to people in a lot of the small towns in Western Mass who didn't have any kind of internet before, or at best they might have been dial up or satellite, not a very good solution. And I was thinking about all the ways that this was going to affect people by having this. Because when the internet started in the 60s, the standard internet speed was 300 bits per second. Wired West was delivering 1 billion bits per second. So you can see there's a sort of enormous evolution in the speeds of the internet. And I also started thinking while I was at about how the use of electricity had advanced over the years. In 1947, when I was a little kid, my mother, I was out shopping with me, she went into a radio store, and what did I see there for the first time but a television set? And on this television set, they were broadcasting for the first time the World Series. The Yankees were playing the Dodgers. And it's did for many years after. That's the first time I saw TV. But most of my young life, I grew up in Long Island, and we had all the so-called modern conveniences. The TV, of course, radio, appliances, an electric stove, as opposed to with gas, and you light with a match. And but when you think about it, those so-called conveniences were nothing compared to what we have today in our home. And I also recall thinking about living without electricity by contrast when I was in the Andes. And then it just suddenly dawned on me, because I knew before that fire was a pivotal development using fire in the evolution of early humans. That's standard, archaeology, anthropology, paleontology stuff. But I realized or believed then that electricity is now becoming a pivotal development in the evolution of modern humans. And that idea was really exciting to me. Wow, this is interesting. So I got to read more about this. So of course, what did I do? I go onto Google, and what do I find? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now, it's not too often you do a Google search, come up completely empty. So I realized, well, if I'm going to figure this out, I have to do it on my own. And that led to writing a book. And I'd like to just, in that book, there's scattered throughout it quotes of people about different quotes about electricity. And if I can find this one is from the late, unfortunately, great filmmaker, David Lynch. And it really describes, how I felt at the time. Every single thing in the world that was made by anyone started with an idea. So to catch one that is powerful enough to fall in love with is one of the most beautiful experiences. It's like being jolted with electricity and knowledge at the same time. Okay, so I began by looking at human evolution, where we came from the past, just to kind of get the sense of this whole process that's been going on. And you can start, say, with the dinosaurs. When they went extinct, there was these little creatures called mammals that lived basically, came out only at night. They were all smaller than squirrels, and they try to keep out of the way of these great big lumbering beasts. But when the dinosaurs disappeared, the mammals came out, proliferated, grew into all kinds of different creatures, evolved, became much larger. And by about 55 million years ago, primates came along. And then about 10 or 15 million years ago, the great apes, and that's the line we come out of. And about 7 million years ago, and that included the great apes, right, with gorillas, chimpanzees, humans. About 7 million years ago, our evolutionary line diverged from that of chimpanzees. And we went on to evolve separately to 2.3 million years ago, when the genus Homo first appeared and we had the first human. So there are four trends in early evolution that I think really matter. One was bipedalism, when the very early pre-human hominins started coming down out of trees and walking and running around the savannah. And they kept walking until about the year 60,000 years ago. They walked right out of Africa and walked all the way around the world and populated the world. And we're still walking, so to speak, exploring today. We've even walked on the moon. So that's one of our characteristics. Secondly, was stone tool making. This was something that started out very, very primitive and it very, very slowly evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of refining these stone tools. Of course, today we have God knows how many tools. Man is a tool-making creature and a tool-using creature. Of course, Jane Goodall pointed out that man is not the only creature to use tools, but we're using it to a degree that no other being really does. Then we learned to use fire, capturing lightnings from lightning strikes, and eventually making our own fires. And the use of that was for cooking, for heat, for light, to scare away predators, and to socialize around the fire. And that led it eventually to language, because if you're sitting around the fire with people, you got to say something. Anyway, the fourth trend was the increase in complexity of our brains, which went in the early hominins from maybe you may be familiar with the fossil called Lucy, which was about 3 million years ago, 3.3 million years ago, I think. This is a pre-human hominin. Her brain was maybe a quarter the size of our brains today. And over time, it's got bigger and bigger until we got to the point that we could call us sapiens, I mean, wise humans. And I think that the brain, above all, is the key to our evolution. Now, so let's take a very brief look at Homo sapiens history. Harari is a historian, and I'm not going to repeat all this stuff he's taken here. You can follow the history in there pretty well. But what is it? Sapiens emerged about 200, maybe 300,000 years ago or more. And by 70,000 years, what Harari described as a cognitive revolution. And as our brains started functioning on a new level. And I think around that time, language began to emerge, complex language. I think before that, probably just simple words and hand signals. Now, there were several other species that existed at the time, and until about 40,000 years ago, when they'd all gone extinct. And coincidentally or not, it happened after Homo sapiens showed up in their territory. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot of our history here. Just I'll mention the fact that about 12,000 years, we started shifting from hunter-gatherers, settling down in agricultural settlements, which grew to villages and larger towns and cities, and ultimately led to the kind of living structure we have today. I think in 1776, there was a real revolution. And I'm not talking about the American Revolution. I'm talking about the invention by James Watt of the steam engine in that year. So this allowed factories to get bigger and bigger and better. People started migrating to cities. And trains and steamships, steam-powered trains and steamships could carry much more freight, many more people, much further than ever before. But think about what a steam engine is. It's really just a fire in a box that's fueled by muscles of humans who are shoveling coal or throwing in wood. So is that such a great advance? I don't know. Probably the steam engine came to its ultimate fulfillment on the Titanic. So the Titanic was propelled this way. There were 176 men, referred to as firemen, who shoveled 1,000 pounds of coal a minute into 159 furnaces. Then I gotta get these numbers straight. Yeah, 159 furnaces that powered 29 boilers that drove this propellers that made the ship go forward. And when the Titanic sank, it's almost symbolic of the steam age sinking as well, because after that, most ships began using their furnaces not to create steam, but to actually generate electricity and run on the electricity. So one of the things that's been said about humans and their development is that large-scale cooperation is really a unique trait of humans. I mean, chimpanzees, for example, they just can't get along in groups of more than about 50, otherwise they start killing each other. And of course, we live in groups of someplace millions. But keep in mind that that kind of living structure is only possible by having large police forces and large armies. And that's because sapiens are characterized by aggressive territoriality, competitiveness, violence. They also exhibit domineering patriarchy and a relentless resource exploitation. So sapiens, they're maybe not such nice people sometimes, as we know. Oh, so electricity, let's talk about that. The word electricity did not even exist until 1600, when it was coined by a British scientist named William Gilbert. And for the next 250 years, it was kind of just a curiosity and a subject of experimentation. We're all familiar, for example, with the Benjamin Franklin's experiment with the kite to transmit what he called electric fire, that was his term, from the cloud down to his key. So it was a wet piece of twine, but effectively a wire. But finally, in the mid-19th century, we had the first real application of electricity that is available everywhere, and that was the telegraph. And today we would call it a disruptive technology, and I'll tell you why. In 1860, the Pony Express was launched, and we've probably all heard of the Pony Express, and it carried mail from Missouri to California in what was then the unheard of time of 10 days. But it's amazing that the Pony Express has such a mythic place in our past, because it only lasted a year and a half. And the reason for that is they came along and laid telegraph wires right along the Pony Express route. And within a year and a half, they put the horses back in the stable, and that was the end of the Pony Express. Another use of the telegram at that point was by Abraham Lincoln, who became a great user of this technology. He said to have sent, almost 1,000 of what he termed lightning messages to his generals during the Civil War. And that helped win the Civil War and then slavery. So we now have the telegraph. So we had a telephone, and then Edison invented the incandescent light bulb. Now this triggered a big competition between Edison and his company, which ultimately became GE, and George Westinghouse. Now Edison used direct current, And Westinghouse used alternating current, and that he was greatly assisted in this effort by a very inventive guy named Nikola Tesla, who created a lot of the elements of AC generation and transmission. And of course, AC became the standard. You may have heard the name William Stanley. If you've driven by the William Stanley Business Park here in Pittsfield. Well, William Stanley wasn't some former mayor that got his name on this piece of property. He was actually a guy who worked for Westinghouse and invented the transformer. And that enabled AC current to be transmitted at very high voltages to down where it was needed and then transformed down to useful voltages. And that was really the key to AC beating out DC. So this era that began with these early inventions, I call the electric age, the beginning of the electric age. Now, some people say that we're living in the atomic age because we set off the bomb in 1945 and we had the power to destroy ourselves. But of course, without electricity, you couldn't develop or deliver the bomb. Now, other people say we're living in the digital or information age because of the prevalence of ports of computers. But without electricity, we'd have no computers, smartphones, anything like that. In fact, without electricity, there wouldn't be much of anything. I mean, just look around this room and you at home, if it weren't for electricity, you wouldn't be watching this. So I think really we need to call this the electric age because since learning to use electricity, humanity's been undergoing a profound transformation. Electricity has replaced fire. It's the basis of human existence. And we relied on fire for at least 1 million years, maybe more. Now, in the last 200 years, that's all switched over to electricity. I mean, in the building I live in, not only is everything electric, you're not even allowed to light a candle because of something, building code, I don't know what. But so electricity has just really become the basis of human civilization. And we are evolving beyond sapiens to become a new species based on electricity that I call Homo electric. Now, computers, smartphones, and the internet, these are the fundamental tools of the electric age, just like the stone axe, hand axe was many millions of years ago. And one of their main uses is to connect us with people, information, and things. And we've seen the meteoric rise of unique electric application called social media. Now, we look back at the invention of social media. When Zuckerberg created Facebook, he wasn't really trying to connect people. What he was doing was making a digital version of a publication that Harvard University put out every year called The Facebook. And in the Facebook were all these pictures, head and shoulder shots of the students at Harvard. And people used to like to look at them and make snarky remarks about who was hot and who was not. So in a way, Zuckerberg tapped inadvertently into this great desire of humans to be connected. And really, that's what social media and a lot of other things do. You might ask, can our electronic connection contacts replace human contact? Now, some of you may remember an ad campaign in the 1980s called Is It Real or Is It Memorex? And Memorex was a tape manufacturer, and the point was that you couldn't tell the difference between a live performance and a recorded performance on Memorex tape. Whether or not that was a bit of an exaggeration is besides the point. But again, today, what is the difference between electronic communication and person-to-person contact? Because far more people are listening to this by an electronic connection than are here. And I had I would say, subject of an inadvertent experiment in remote communication. When COVID broke out just about 6 years ago and they implemented quarantines, I was living with my wife way deep in the woods of the Berkshires, and she passed away sadly shortly after that. And was immunocompromised for reasons I won't get into, but I was, and so I had to be very, very careful. And so I lived for 2 years with almost no human contact. Oh, I went out shopping once a week, and once in a while the FedEx got me covered, something like that. But basically, and there was no funeral, no memorial service. But basically, all my connection with my friends and family for 2 years were electronically. And I couldn't have lived without that. And I will say that you are able to communicate emotions through electronic communication. I mean, think about some email you wrote or some telephone conversation you had. So I'm not saying that electronic communications are replacing human contact, but I think that they're playing a very important role. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about evolution, because the concept of evolution is itself evolving. Now, under the classical theory of evolution that I said before, is a struggle for survival, variation in traits lead to natural selection, the more favorable ones, heredity then passes on to the traits. And heredity is said to be like a blueprint, a fixed plan governed by the genes in our DNA. But there's a lot of new thinking in the 21st century that says the genes alone do not determine who we are. And I won't get into too much detail. There's a word epigenetics. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Epi is from the Greek word on top of. And these are molecules that sit on top of our genes, and they can turn genes on and off. So and there's an epigenome, a collection of all these things. And so the genes, the epigenome kind of acts as a middleman between the genes and the outside world. I should say the inside world of the rest of your body, the external environment, and importantly, human culture. So it's not strictly up to the genes to determine how we develop. I want to focus a bit on cultural evolution. There's a professor at Harvard named Joe Henrich, who said that cultural evolution has been driving physical genetic evolution for hundreds of thousands of years, what he calls the culture gene coevolution. And here's what he has to say about that. He says, the culture gene coevolution drove our species down a novel evolutionary pathway not observed elsewhere in nature, making us very different from other species, a new kind of animal. You would say a cultural animal, because other animals have, little vestiges of culture, and they have little rules of behavior, but they did not, by any means, any other creature than humans. Is that the light, or is that the light is not out? Is that our transmission?
That's so weird.
See, without electricity, we have nothing. Are we still on air?
Yeah. It's just.
Okay, yeah. Well, that was a rather graphic demonstration. Anyway, to go on here with what he said, I'll give you an example of culture driving genetic evolution. The emergence of language is a cultural phenomenon. But when we started speaking, our speech mechanisms were still much ape-like. There we go, electricity is back. And what happened, not very good for speaking, and so what happened is the need to speak, cultural factor, drove the genetic evolution of our speech mechanisms to be able to speak better. So as Henrik also talks about what he calls the collective brain, and that is our ability to learn from one another gives rise to this so-called collective brain, and larger and more connected societies have larger and more connected brains. So as we become more interconnected, human culture will evolve rapidly. And I came up with a paraphrase of what, let's see, did I leave myself? Yeah, here we go. What Henry said, and that is this. So rephrase Henry. This culture gene evolution is driving humanity down a novel evolutionary pathway, making us very different from other species of humans, a new kind of human, Homo electric. Now, we can talk a little bit about how the environment influences our evolution. And until maybe about 100 years ago, the only manifestations in the globe of electromagnetic radiation were what the inherent Earth's magnetic field, heat and light from the sun, and much more in the stars, so that was much less important. But then in the 1920s, radio went, quote, on the air. And that means when radio was on the air, it was actually in the air because it's transmitting radio waves throughout the air. Okay, that's electromagnetic radiation, EMR for short. And now since we have TV, we have cell phones, we have microwave, we have satellites. We're just immersed constantly in electromagnetic radiation. Now, you're probably familiar with the old image of this ancient creature crawling out of the sea to get on dry land and evolve from there. I think in a way you can look at us modern humans as crawling from dry land into a sea of EMR, which is where we now live. So we know, how does this affect us? We don't know yet. We do know, that biologists know, that the external environment can affect our nervous systems and our hormones. And in turn, this can lead to epigenetic effects on gene expression. I just like to, there's a very renowned professor, now emeritus at Oxford, professor of biology and physiology called David Dennis Noble, very highly respected guy. And Dennis Noble says that our biological systems influence our genes. Quote, genes are not the blueprint of life. And I'd like to read you just one more quote here along those lines. By a guy named Howard Bloom, who wrote a book called The Global Brain. And again, maybe I've lost Howard here, but no, here he is. So Howard Bloom says, and the book's on one page, bear with me. Okay, Howard Bloom wrote, social experience literally shapes critical details of brain physiology, sculpting an infant's brain to fit the culture into which the child is born. And so children today, their brains are being affected by this electronic environment and are being shaped to work and live in an electric culture. So electricity is driving heredity and evolution in ways we cannot ignore. We don't know yet how or whether our genomes differ, genomes in sapiens differ from genomes in evolving electrics. We could experiment, I'm not capable of doing this, but we could take genomes from people who lived, say, 200 years ago, and, there are potter's fields and a lot of places where human parts are preserved. We could compare the DNA of people who lived just before electricity with people living today. What that would produce, I don't know, but I think it's really worth experimenting and finding out. Well, I think we can say that the culture, the environment, and epigenetics are changing us and bringing about evolution of a new species, which I call Homo electric. Because we're no longer living in the state of nature that Darwinian evolution envisioned. Many unnatural factors affect our development and survival like modern medicine. Today, 90% of children born in an electrified society will reach childbearing age. And it's completely unheard of in the natural world. It used to be that something like 1 out of 3 children born did not live to the age of 5. But modern medicine has changed all that. And now we have in vitro fertilization, which accounts for about 2% of births in the US. We have all kinds of body part replacements. We now have something called CRISPR, which enables us to edit DNA. So we're actually able to change how our body function, how we survive, how our genes function. And the choices we make about our survival constitute what I might call unnatural selection. I'm not saying that natural selection is kaput, but I am saying that humans are able to intervene in the process. So in my book, I talk about various aspects of electric culture, like an anthropologist might. And one of the ones, I'm not going to go into all of them here, there's no time, but one of the things I've focused on is what I call extended intelligence. And that's, we now as humans have the ability, singly and collectively, to access, store, access, and process information outside the brain. We know all about computers and, I think this extended intelligence is really one of the most significant evolutionary advances in human history. Because up until very recently, all intelligence resided within us, and now intelligence exists in devices like this that we carry around in your pocket. They are outside the human brain. One form of extended intelligence has been very controversial recently, I think will continue to be, is artificial intelligence. And I'm not going to say much about that, other than the fact that it's self-evolving very rapidly, and it's both supplementing and supplanting human activities. Where that's going to go, nobody really knows. Efforts to slow down development of AI or to regulate by government so far have led to nothing. Some people fear that AI is going to take over by developing a consciousness of its own. Personally, I believe that because humans created AI, in the long run, that we will be able to control it. And in fact, we'll probably need AI for things like mitigating climate change. Because I think in time, we're going to have to look at the globe. It's one very large, massive, interconnected system. We're going to have to manage that system like we manage any other system. And because of the scale of that, we'll need things like AI to be able to do that if we are to survive. So that means that I talked about humans cooperating. We're going to have to cooperate at a far greater scale in Homo sapiens every day. When astronauts first circled the moon, and they looked back at the Earth, it was a revelation. Awareness of the Earth as a home to all humans, to all life for that matter. And this planetary awareness, as I call it, is a characteristic of Homo erectus. You can use computers all you want. You can do social media, But if your consciousness doesn't evolve, if your planetary awareness doesn't evolve, then I think you're just still in the sapiens who's good at computers. Um, I, but I do believe that the world order today, which is not very conducive to solving some of these problems like global warming. I think that's really going to change, because if you look at evolution in many aspects of it, it tends to evolve toward more complex systems. And I think that a world order of some kind, say to actually regulate climate change, the Paris Agreement that we all signed, is really a voluntary agreement. No nation's really bound to follow it. And then, after it was created under Biden, then Trump got elected and he withdrew. Then Biden got elected, he joined again. Then Trump got elected and he withdrew. So we really need a mechanism that really has enforcement mechanism and the authority to be able to enforce rules to control climate change. And I think that will happen. Many years ago, I had a vision about a global consciousness arising, and then many other people have had visions like this. And there are things that, like, you've heard of the Gaia hypothesis, and in a way, the world is like an organism, or the global village. So I think that these one world theories have been criticized by a lot of people. But I think they also represent a belief in our connectedness. It's a belief, I think, that's rising. Darwin wrote, "Endless forms, most beautiful and wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So too is it for those wondrous creatures, human beings. The actions we take individually and together will influence the course of our evolution beyond Homo sapiens to Homo electric. Now, many sapiens will not relinquish the traits that make them sapiens: aggressive territoriality, relentless resource exploitation, domineering patriarchy. They'll not cease trying to exert divisive and controlling power over others. I call people like this sapiopaths, and you can probably think of somebody who fits that description. He's in the news all the time. And I think that time this could lead to, an interspecies conflict between sapiens and electric. But in the end, evolution is patient and evolution is relentless. Evolution left behind other human species like the Neanderthals, and it's going to leave behind Homo sapiens. And ultimately, a unified planet will emerge. So for perhaps 2 million years, let's say, fire was the foundation of human existence. But in less than 200 years, we have transitioned to electricity as the foundation of our existence. Electricity is a new fire, what I call fire in the water. We're living in a time of epical evolutionary change. A new human species is emerging, living among us today. Homo electric. I am electric. Are you? Thank you. So 2 things, I guess, start with some questions.
Yes, we have some questions from the chat. Can you hear me okay, Steve? Can you hear me okay? Do you want me to-
Not very well.
Okay, I'll talk loud. So the first one was, do you believe we have possible natural experimental environments to test out some of your observations? In other words, are there still places on Earth where electricity use is
I'm
minimal?
sorry,
Are there still places on Earth where electricity use is minimal?
I'm not following.
I'm gonna come closer.
Yeah, come closer. I'm stuffed up your ear.
Sorry. Okay, So, do you believe we have possible natural experimental environments to test out some of your observations? Are there still places on Earth where electricity use is minimal? And can we somehow compare people in those environments to people in high electricity environments?
Yeah, they're actually, I think there are over 1 billion people who do not have electricity, and there's in fact a big project in Africa right now to bring electricity to about 600,000 people. But there still are pockets of humans even living as hunter-gatherers. There's a very interesting documentary done about 10 years ago, I think, called The Hadza, which is about a tribe in Africa which is purely living as hunter-gatherers. They hadn't even gotten to the agricultural revolution yet. And of course, we see scattered tribes in the Amazon that have, and are not allowed to have, but we're not allowed to contact them. But I think that other than that, inevitably, we're all going to be electrified because we all want electricity. Is there anybody out there that says, no, I don't want electricity? When that Africa project got underway, an African woman was quoted from a previous project to say, well, now we can be normal people because there's too much we can differently. We can't really survive anymore with electricity. I mean, it provides our food, it provides medical care, it provides computers, it gets involved with sex. Electricity is just something that we can no longer survive without. And I think in the end, it will everywhere pretty much will be electrified.
Next question, is there evidence of evolutional changes due to EMR in lower forms of life, like insects and birds?
That's really an interesting question because I think that to see what that evidence is, you really have to look at the genome, as I said before, of say people who lived before all this EMR surrounded us. And of course, that's not something that I'm able to do. There's been some focus on people talking about health effects of living near, towers and wind turbines and all that. But then I'm talking about something much more fundamental. It's really changing us internally. And personally, I believe that over time it will, because we've seen that culture and the environment will affect our genome. And we just don't know yet whether that particular aspect of it has. But there was virtually no EMR in the atmosphere 200 years ago. And now you don't see it, but it's penetrating all of us all the time.
Do you know of anybody who's doing study on the genome around that question?
No, I don't. And at the end of the book, I said that, scientists and journalists, poets, filmmakers, other people besides me need to really explore some of these questions, because I think we're really, kind of living in a new landscape, this electric world, and we haven't really fully understood what the implications of it are to us as humans. And, I just encourage, to put in my 2 cents, but I would just encourage other people, and particularly people who have a scientific or real scientific background, other than my college, physics class.
Yeah.
To really explore this, because I think it's worth exploring. I think we can't just say, oh, this doesn't matter. It does matter. We just don't know how quite it matters.
A related question, separate from the genetics question, does electricity change human nature? It seems that has not changed in thousands of years, and electricity won't change things like greed and jealousy and those kinds of things.
I'm sorry.
That they're wondering about whether electricity would change things in human nature, like greed and jealousy and those kinds of things would be more fundamental.
It is a philosophical question.
Yes.
I'm not going to attempt to answer.
Okay.
But it just changes, it does change us in certain ways. How it changes that kind of behavior, I couldn't really say. I think that certain aspects of us, I mean, if you look at, I use this example, if you look at the people who are sitting in the Globe Theater watching Shakespeare's plays back in the day, in certain ways, they were not much different than people who first settled down in agricultural settlements 12,000 years ago. But there are certain aspects of their humanity and that were expressed by Shakespeare that, I think will, continue forever. And I think there's a certain essence to being human. But I think the way certain other parts of our behavior manifest is affected by electricity very much so. Anybody here?
Another question. Electricity, the way we get it,
You have to speak up.
now we get it on a grid. But while things are evolving and people are becoming more independent with solar energy, wind farming, etc., do you think that'll have an affect society in some way?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so.
Sorry.
He was wondering about if, with some of our electricity now coming from off of the grid, if that will.
Affect our lives.
If that, how that might impact our lives.
Well, it's interesting because I was involved in a pioneering program in the late 70s to advance the use of renewable energy in the aftermath of what was then the oil shocks of the 70s, which we seem to be reliving today. At that time, I got really fascinated by photovoltaics, by generating electricity with solar. And at that time, it was way, way too expensive to use in a practical way. But by the 20-teens, the price had come down so far that residential solar was actually the fastest growing industry in the United States. And if you think about it, we used to be able to sit around and, make a fire. We can still do it, but that's what people did. And now we can make our own electricity with solar panels. So I think, of course, you've got to get over some of the governmental obstacles to using renewables. The US administration just shelled out, I just read this today, shelled out $1 billion to a company in France to stop installing wind turbines off the coast. I mean, this is crazy. No, but I think, this is short term. Long term, we're going to, renewables will play a bigger and bigger role in our energy supply. I mean, as it is now, coal plays a very small role. Oil plays, other than transportation, plays a very small role in electric generation.
From the chat, there was a question, I think only about 10% of the human genome is quote unquote active. Maybe some of the unused genome will become activated as we continue to evolve.
Well, it'll be interesting to find out, and maybe that's true. I'm not in the business to say, but again, I think that what's going on here is really profound. It's really profound. Fire was the basis of our existence for 1 million years, and now in 200 years, electricity is really displacing it. And so it's still very early in the game, so to speak. But the kind of changes that this will engender, we're kind of in the middle of this transition, so sometimes it's really hard to know what's going on and what its long-term effects will be. I looked at how long enough to be able to, maybe some will see or won't either, to be able to see some of that. But it's no question in my mind that this is going to continue to have a profound impact on how human beings live and who they are.
Yes, here, wait, let me bring this over to you so that folks on Zoom can hear you. Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I'm gonna be able to articulate my question, but I will say that I've experienced a landslide of new concepts here, many of which I don't instantly embrace. And I'm struggling to understand exactly what the implications are that you are stating. But I did hear you make one comment, which I'd like to focus on, which is that the definition of evolution has changed. Did I understand that correctly?
So you're gonna be able to repeat that?
I'm gonna do my best. So, he was saying that, he was wondering about to clarify that you were saying that the definition of evolution has changed?
Yeah,
Is that correct?
Yeah.
as it is changing,
Is changing.
because, and this isn't widely accepted by everybody. But there are a lot of scientists who are talking about some things I was talking about, that the gene is no longer completely rules our evolution. That the genes themselves are affected by other factors, and this is kind of new thinking, because it's really the idea up until, you know, maybe the century was that the gene rules all, the gene determines all. And, but I agree with people, I don't think that's really true, I think, you know, Professor Henry, some of his work on how culture has affected evolution, I mean, it's quite clear this has been going on for a long time. So it could just, we haven't really recognized that until recently, many people are. I had some other quotes I could read you along those lines.
Staying on that point, and my own bias is toward what I think I know as traditional evolution. Do you believe that natural selection still occurs and is necessary for evolution?
Do you believe that natural selection still occurs and is necessary to evolution?
Yeah, I think natural selection does occur to some degree, but there's so many ways in which we intervene in this process. I mean, babies that were born through IVF would not have been born. Whatever their traits were, would not have been passed down, and now they are. And the same thing is true of you know, the safety of childbirth and the very low rates of child and maternal mortality. So I'm not, as I said, I'm not saying natural selection doesn't exist, but I think among humans, it's really tempered by the fact that we have ability to interfere with it. I mean, the implications of CRISPR are really yet to be fully understood. But once you can start going in there and editing genes, what does natural selection mean anymore?
I just think one implication is that without natural selection, you end up not having evolution, which is to say that it's not just the fittest that will survive, it's everyone that survives.
So without natural selection, that it's not just the fittest, but it's that everyone could survive.
Will survive.
Will survive, yeah.
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 Now, again, natural selection is still important, but it doesn't stand alone anymore. And we have to understand how other factors enter into the equation, so to speak. It's much more complex. I mean, I think Darwin was really brilliant, but I don't think he really, and how could he understand modern humans? And I don't think, well, maybe we need to just know more about it, and we have many, many tools to understand it better. You know, like the genome, we didn't even fully understand that until, you know, not so many years ago, this century. So I think our ability to understand these things, but at the same time, our ability to interrupt them. You know, there was a time that, you know, if you lost a limb, you were probably doomed. Now we just slap a new one on. It's not that simple, obviously, but we're just not subject to the same natural forces. And because we don't live in a world of nature, we live in a man-made world. I mean, I see trees outside and I see grass and I see birds, and it's all very well, and there are even wild animals who out in the woods somewhere. There's probably a bobcat or a deer or something. But these are sort of now become secondary. That's where humans have just taken over the world, and it's our world. And it's our world for better or worse, and to make better of it. But, and I'm, very much, a conservationist, an ecologist, love animals. But I have to recognize that it's just not the same thing as it was. When I was in Peru, I had an encounter with a mountain lion. And, I was safe. I was in a car, but the mountain lion was right there because they live way up in the Andes and they could come down looking for food. Was buzzed by a condor. So these things, they still exist out there in the wild. But more and more, there is no such thing as the wild. They're all, I hate to use the word, zoos. We preserve them, we want them to continue, we protect them, we nurture them. But in a way, a lot of natural world only exists in our forbearance. And unfortunately, we haven't foreborn enough in certain ways, but that's another story.
A slightly different topic area. Somebody said, I've been hearing a lot about the negative effects of screen time on people's mental health.
Of what?
Screen time.
Screen time.
Yeah. And they asked, what do you think is the optimal amount of connection? What do you think the optimal amount of connection is to keep humanity in a good position? And having had your experience of being pretty isolated for a while, you might be particularly well.
Well, if I judge by my own behavior every day, about the optimal amount of screen time is, that would probably not be a good answer.
Sure.
And I don't, because I just, on my computer, constantly. In fact, I don't even own a TV. I see everything through my computer. So, but a TV is just another form of screen. Yeah, particularly with social media, doing that attempts now to, regulate it, to prevent, the children from using it, from bringing smartphones into the classroom. And, I'm not gonna make a judgment that one way or another, but I think we do have to learn to use this stuff more wisely. That, we do kind of, overdo it. But I don't have any particular prescription. I'm not gonna tell you, well, don't stay on your screen for more than 3 hours a day, because, I'd be violating that by lunchtime.
One person noted, I hope you include Walt Whitman's "I Sing the Body Electric" somewhere in your book.
I'm sorry?
Somebody said that they hope that you used "I Sing the Body Electric" somewhere in your book, Walt Whitman.
Body electric, yes.
Yeah.
I try to work that quote in. Because it's interesting, because of course, Whitman wrote that, I think around the time of the Civil War. And that was when people were becoming aware of electricity. It had come out of the lab. And it was no longer, just a curiosity. And I think that was very much, in the air, so to speak, this concept of electricity. I don't think, as I said, the word didn't even exist until 1600. Because there was no such thing. When I use the term Homo electric, species are usually named with two Latin names, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo erectus, I'm naming some species of humans. So when I thought about that, there is no Latin word for electricity, because there was no electricity. In fact, where Gilbert came up with it was because the ancient Greeks had used the word electron with a K for amber. It meant amber, because they knew that by rubbing amber with a silk cloth, it could produce static electricity. So that word came from the word electricity really came from the word for amber in ancient Greek. There's no Latin word for electricity, never has been, and people try to concoct them, so I just use the common English word electric.
Mhm.
Couldn't come up with anything else.
An observation. Electricity has made it possible for us to communicate with huge numbers of people and to learn things we otherwise would never have learned. And that is clearly going to change what happens in the future.
Yeah, we can communicate. I think it's not only that we can communicate with each other, but we can communicate simultaneously in real time to millions of people. This goes on every night on TV. You know, and the TV audience is it can be in the tens or twenties of millions. You know, over 100 million people watch the Super Bowl. I'm not sure what they're learning from that. You know, the halftime show was interesting, I thought. But this is something that was never possible before. You can only communicate by being in front of somebody or, you know, yelling at them from one hill to the next. Now you don't have to yell anymore. You just have to type.
Yep. Another statement, EMR has existed since the universe began and most is natural.
Yes, it is, but until recently, we didn't know how to use it. So there was some background EMR just from the Earth's own magnetic field and from the sun, you know, sending its heat and light. So I mentioned that. But once we started learning how to use it, you know, we use the electromagnetic spectrum for all kinds of things. You know, radio, TV, cell phones, microwaves, you know, on and on. And satellites are beaming, you know, there's this new generation of satellites, communication satellites for you know, internet and that sort of thing, that are going to be in what they call a low Earth orbit. They're only gonna be a few hundred miles up. And actually Elon Musk and who else is involved, Amazon, yeah, Jeff Bezos is involved. They're going to be putting up tens of thousands of these satellites. I think this is a little insane, but there's nothing to stop them really. And these things are just, you know, they're sending their signals down all the time, everywhere. I mean, when you turn to a channel, say, well, I won't use it. If you have a TV or radio that's taking signals off the air and not cable, and you turn the station on your radio, what they do is tuning into a different frequency that's already there. It's just everywhere. So it's like, as I said, we kind of lived the sea of EMR, which before we didn't, and there have to be implications of that in terms of how humans live and develop. You know, I don't have any studies that we're getting these diseases or not getting these diseases. It's more than that. It's really fundamentally, is that affecting our brain? And you might ask, how's it affecting animals? Speaking of animals, they live in the same environment. You know, they can't do anything about it, but you know, they're all exposed to this stuff too. So what is the implication for animals? I don't really know.
Other questions, Norm? Oh, yeah.
In 2009, can you hear me?
No, she'll translate.
In 2009, I went to a small series of lectures in City University of New York. And they had an anthropologist, an evolutionary anthropologist speaking. And he said that the human Homo sapiens were basically after the age of 27 years old. They don't really matter anymore. We're also like secondary people because that is the height of reproduction and procreation. And that is what evolution is all about. And so, everyone looks around and goes, well, we're just preserving our life because we want to enjoy it, but we're not doing anything directly for the species. Do you see that there would be a new sort of metric for judging the success of a Homo electric species?
Okay, I'm not gonna get everything you said, but, so, the summary version. Yeah, is, so an anthropologist, at SUNY.
At City University of New York.
City University of New York was talking about how, evolutionary, in terms of evolution, that sort of after 27, after the peak reproductive years, that we are no longer evolutionarily relevant. And so, do you see with this sort of change in how we interact with the world with electricity, that may be changing? Yeah?
Yeah, or a new, what would be the measure of success?
Oh, yes,
of
thank
the
you.
species?
What would be the measure of success of the species rather than just reproduction?
Survival would be my measure of success, given that that's always been an issue for all species, all time. And, we have certain different kind of issues for surviving, in terms of climate, weapons, things like that. But I don't think that we're evolutionarily irrelevant. I think that from an evolutionary standpoint, we're more relevant than ever. Because humans spread around the globe. As I said, we really have taken over the globe, and now we're sending all our EMR everywhere. And we're just living in a way that presumably benefits us, not always. Whether or not it benefits other living creatures, we don't think too much about that, just, here and there. I often think about, in terms of this, whole world. Polar bears are on the verge, perhaps, of extinction. We don't really know that, but, there have been some signs that polar bears are not doing well because of all the ice melting. So if the polar bears went extinct, would that affect us materially in any way? No, it wouldn't. But would it affect us from a consciousness standpoint? I think it would affect us profoundly because we are kind of tuned in, so to speak, to this whole world. We are developing a global consciousness and awareness. And I think that's very different than humans did in the past. They were thinking about their little piece of property, their neighborhood, their country. But in recent years, we've just become, as I say, since we saw what Carl Sagan called a pale blue dot, looking at that from space, the picture I reproduced in my book, very famous, of seeing the Earth rising over the moon. I think this has changed how we perceive the universe and how we perceive our place in it. And that was not that long ago in evolutionary time, obviously. I think that we're in a whole, we're going through a whole new world and then transition. And when you're in the middle of the transition, you often don't see it because it's all going on around you. It's only afterwards, sometimes you step back, you're struggling. Oh, gee, that was the Industrial Revolution. I don't know if they really thought of it as the Industrial Revolution in their middle of it. They just thought of it, there's jobs in the city, let's move from the farm to the city. But it takes some time to get, some perspective on something. And that's, in a way, that's what we're lacking. We lack perspective in a way on what's going on because we're too much in the middle of it. Too much of it is still unfolding. But, it's clear, as Bob Dylan said, something is happening here and you don't know what it is, Mr. Jones.
Thank you. All right, let me Check the chat.
Are we signing off?
Let me check the chat one more
Okay.
time.
Check the chat.
Oh, somebody was noting that the satellites could get their power from the sun and replace data centers.
Yeah, they have solar panels.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they generate electricity.
All right. I think there are a couple of questions I didn't get to, but they're in a similar ballpark to
Yeah,
other ones
okay.
that we did. So I think we can wrap up. Unless you want to have a last word.
My last word is, we all have to be thinking about this and exploring it. I just throwing this out there for, I'll quote myself. I think that's the easiest thing to do. In this book, I try to understand and explain how we are being evolved, to quote Darwin. I hope the anthropologists, geneticists, biologists, journalists, artists, poets, and others will join me in exploring the vast terrain of our electrified world, in better understanding the people who are emerging to inhabit it. And I think that's a big challenge for all of us ahead to understand what's going on and what we need to do about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.